We now have a lot more candidates for the Jets general manager and head coaching jobs, but the best choices might not be the obvious candidates you're thinking about. I'll explain why today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Tuesday, January 7th, 2024, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. A big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. This year, you can get a big return on FanDuel because new customers can place a $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets if you win or lose your first $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. We have a lot to talk about today on the New York Jets head coaching and general manager searches. Monday was a big day. We got a lot more candidates, and that was expected because the Jets were not allowed to ask permission to interview anybody who is currently employed by an NFL team, either for their open general manager or their open head coaching job, until the regular season ended. So the Jets were able to kind of line things up. We were expecting this to be a big day of activity. It seemed like the Jets were very well organized. They were able to ask permission to interview a lot of candidates. It's what you would expect because the Jets fired their head coach and general managers early, and they had time to think through which candidates did they want to ask permission for. So a lot of new head coaching candidates, a lot of general manager candidates. Let's start by talking about the head coaching job. Now, you see a lot of names that are the usual suspects. Aaron Glenn, who done a great job this year as the Detroit Lions defensive coordinator. Brian Flores, the Minnesota Vikings defensive coordinator, former Miami Dolphins head coach. They already interviewed Mike Vrabel. He was not a new name from last week, but there are also some unconventional names on this list. One of them is Brian Griese. He's the quarterbacks coach of the San Francisco 49ers. He's only been a coach for 3 years, but prior to 2022, he was actually a broadcaster. He decided to leave the broadcasting field and go into coaching. Josh McCown, former Jets quarterback. It wasn't that long ago Josh McCown was playing for the Jets. Of course, this year he's the Vikings quarterbacks coach, working with Sam Darnold, just as he did as a player. He was kind of a player coach with the Jets when Sam Darnold was a rookie. McCown, now a quarterbacks coach, has already gotten head coaching buzz prior to this. The Houston Texans have been interested in him a couple of times as their head coach. So some guys who are like normal names who you'd expect, and some guys who are kind of like outside the box candidates. I think that it's very easy to misjudge what you're looking for in a head coach because I think every year the media drives this narrative that there's a specific checklist that you need to have as a head coaching candidate. You need to have so many years as a coordinator. You need to be a coordinator of a team that's good this year. And the most recent results matter. You see this every time. You see this every single year at this time of the year where some team has a huge week 18 game or some team has a huge playoff game and suddenly their coordinator becomes even hotter, or vice versa, where maybe an offensive coordinator's unit struggles in a playoff game, or defensive coordinator's defense gets lit up and people say, well, he's not a very good coach. These are the wrong things to look at. One example that I always use, people act like there is a specific resume you need, again, X years as a coordinator, this level of success. There's a coach, Romeo Crennel. He was a head coach in the NFL 3 different times, with Cleveland, with Kansas City, and with Houston. Romeo Crennel worked his way up from a position coach to a coordinator. As an assistant coach, he won 5 Super Bowl rings. He worked for Bill Parcells, and then he worked for Bill Belichick, 2 Hall of Fame coaches. And he was just a really, really bad head coach. Some people are better as the man behind the man than being the person in charge. And, you go down the list. Who are the hot candidates every year? Sometimes the hottest name pans out like Kyle Shanahan. But you know who was the hottest head coaching candidate the year before the 49ers hired Kyle Shanahan? It was Adam Gase, who was hired by the Dolphins. Adam Gase was viewed as the next head coaching superstar. I can give you a lot of examples of guys who broke the mold. In 1999, there was a team that hired a then 40-year-old coach who only had 4 years of NFL experience. And of those 4 years, 2 of them were as an assistant position coach. 2 of them were as a position coach. He had never called plays before. He had never been a coordinator. 40 years old, 4 years of NFL experience, 2 years as a position coach, 2 years as an assistant position coach. That's a terrible hire, right? Well, that was Andy Reid when the Eagles hired him. If you want to talk about 2006, a team hired a guy who had been a coach in the NFL for 6 years. He was 34 years old. He only had 1 year of experience as a coordinator. That was Mike Tomlin when the Pittsburgh Steelers hired him. A year later, a team hired a guy who had been a special teams coach for the bulk of his career, had 1 year also working as a defensive backs coach. That was John Harbaugh. You could go down, we could keep going down the list. Back in 2017, a team hired a guy who was just over 30 years old. Was he too young to be a head coach? Well, that was Sean McVay. You want to go back to the last search Mike Tannenbaum ran looking for a Jets head coach. That was 2009 when Tannenbaum was the Jets general manager. He interviewed a lot of candidates. It was a very thorough search. In fact, thinking through Tannenbaum's role in this, and I know Tannenbaum's tenure with the Jets did not end well, but he, for whatever issues I had with Tannenbaum, thinking back, and I went back through some of the stuff I wrote, because I've been doing this for so long that I was actually writing on my website back in 2009 when Tannenbaum ran the search that landed Rex Ryan. During that search, the Jets interviewed a guy who was a major college head coach. He had been a major college head coach for 2 years. At that point, his record was 9-15 in those 2 years. That was Jim Harbaugh. So the point is, you may see these names and you may say, well, that guy doesn't seem experienced enough. That guy doesn't check the boxes. You never know, though. And I think one of the things that's true in the NFL is the conventional wisdom is completely wrong on what makes a good head coach. It's not about how much experience you have. It's not about leading an offense with this ranking or that ranking. It's about things that are difficult to quantify. It's about things that are difficult to describe. It's about, first of all, having a plan for how you're going to lead your organization. It's about understanding what your weaknesses are and hiring a staff to compensate for those weaknesses. It's understanding what you want schematically. It's understanding what you want in players. It's understanding the little details. Which of your coaches are going to be in the booth versus which of the guys are going to be on the field, because that makes a big difference. Sometimes you're better off with a certain guy on the field. Sometimes you're better off with a certain guy in the booth. There are pros and cons to having guys in each spot. Every team has a mix of, sometimes the offensive coordinator is on the field. Sometimes he's in the booth. Sometimes some of the position coaches are on the field. Sometimes they're in the booth. There are pros and cons to each of these things. Thinking about your game management philosophies, thinking about how you're going to run your offseason program. And these things are difficult for us to see from the outside. And these are the things that we can't tell. You could be the most experienced guy in the NFL and not really have thought these things through. You could be an experienced assistant, but as an assistant, you never really have to worry about these things. You never really have to think about these things. Whereas, you could be a brand new assistant coach. Again, some of the guys I just listed did not have a lot of experience in the league, but they had thought through how they were going to operate these things. They thought through how they were going to run these things, and they ended up hitting the ground running and being great head coaches right off the bat. There's no formula for finding a great head coach. So I'm not sure that Josh McCown's going to be a great head coach, although a lot of people seem to think he will. I don't know that Brian Griese would be a great head coach, but I'm not ready to dismiss them, though. I think these are outside-the-box candidates. And again, I think Tannenbaum, for all of his faults during his time here, he's a guy who's very thorough on these searches. And the more I think about it, the more we'll see. I could change my mind if I don't like the hire, but the more I think about it, the more I'm happy with the way he conducts these searches. At least, maybe I didn't love the way he ran the cap. Maybe I didn't love some of his roster management when he was here, but I think back to that 2009 search. It was very well run. It was very thorough. And, even though Rex Ryan did not end up being the long-term coach for the Jets, and even though there were issues with him and there was baggage with him, in the moment, there were many ways he was right for that team. So I'm encouraged right now. This is cautious encouragement. And I think that it's too early to rule certain candidates out, because really at the end of the day, all of this is projection. And nobody really knows for sure how somebody's going to project to a head coaching job. We can guess, but so frequently these things come down to superficial prognostications, like whose offense was good this year or whose offense had a good game. I remember last year, Dan Quinn was Dallas's defensive coordinator, and they got torched in the playoff game against Green Bay, and people acted like it would be ridiculous to hire him as a head coach after that game. Well, it was one game. It doesn't tell you about somebody's capabilities as a head coach. And what has Quinn done? Quinn's led a surprise playoff appearance in year one. So I don't know that we can necessarily rule people out. And I think it's important to move forward with caution, because the people who are perceived as the best head coaches are not always. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, let's talk about the GM search, because the Jets are also running a search for a general manager. There aren't quite as many candidates for GM at this moment. I think each of them brings something different to the table, though. And the choice the Jets make may tell you what they prioritize. We'll go into more detail on that as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Prize Picks. It's playoff time, and if you're like me, you want to make the most of these final weeks of football action. Well, that's where Prize Picks comes in. If you love football and want a chance to win real money while watching the games, Prize Picks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. With Prize Picks, you simply pick more or less on player stats like total passing yards or rushing touchdowns, and for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your money, you can make your picks in less than 60 seconds. And whether you're looking for a flex play to boost your payout or you want to cash out quickly, Prize Picks has got you covered. And with over 10 million members and billions in winnings, it's clear that people are loving this platform. And here's a special for Locked On NFL listeners. Download the app today and use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup at Prize Picks. Again, it's a special offer for Locked On NFL listeners. You download the app today and you use code Locked On NFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup at Prize Picks. Run your game. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you every day, as this is the daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. In many ways, the 2025 season got underway on Monday for the New York Jets because the 2024 season ended on Sunday with the team's final game of the year. It was a victory over the Miami Dolphins, but now 2024 is officially in the rearview mirror, and the Jets are starting to build their team for 2025, and the first thing they need to do are pick a head coach and pick a general manager. Well, the Jets inquired about the availability of a number of potential general manager candidates. I think they all bring a little something different to the table. Now, there's assistant general manager from the Kansas City Chiefs named Mike Borgonzi, and this is like the chalk guy. This is like your typical general manager candidate, the number 2 guy in the front office on the best team in the league. And Borgonzi is, he's been Brett Veach's right-hand man for a number of years in Kansas City. The danger with somebody like this is I think there's a temptation to think that you add like some peripheral part of a team like the Chiefs, you put them in charge of your team, and you think that like they have a magic wand, and they immediately turn you into the Chiefs. That doesn't always happen. But you like the idea that this guy has seen the way a good organization functions. Now, again, it's a catch-22 because he's never had to work with an owner like Woody Johnson before, and working around Woody's a little bit of a different task than what Borgonzi's got in Kansas City. But it's a team that does things very professionally. In fact, I think a lot of people underrate how professional the Chiefs are run. I think that there's a perception, well, they have Mahomes. Of course, they'll be great. Everybody forgets, though, this was always a good team before Mahomes. They were regularly winning division titles. They were regularly going to the playoffs. When Mahomes took them was from a division champion into a Super Bowl team. They handle things very well. They draft well. They handle their cap well. They're willing to move on from players where it makes sense, even when it's painful. If the Jets hire Borgonzi, I think it means that they prioritize somebody from a winning organization, somebody who understands the way winning teams are built. Another candidate is the guy who has been my favorite through this whole search, a guy I've mentioned on a number of occasions, Alec Halaby, who's the assistant general manager from the Philadelphia Eagles. Now, you may remember Joe Douglas, the last Jets general manager, was also an assistant GM with Philadelphia. And it's a bit unconventional to go to the same place 2 straight times, especially after you feel like the first guy failed. Usually, if you hire a head coach who previously was the offensive coordinator of Indianapolis and you fire that guy, the next head coach you hire is not going to be the offensive coordinator of Indianapolis. But Halaby brings a different skill set than Joe Douglas. Joe Douglas was always like kind of an old school football guy, whereas Halaby is viewed as maybe the top analytics executive in the NFL. And I think that football more and more is going towards analytics. Now, when I say that, people have this idea that means you're going to fire all the scouts and just do everything by spreadsheet. No, it means incorporating analytics in a sensible way, the way that makes sense. And that's what the Philadelphia Eagles do as well as any organization in the league. I think that if the Jets hire Halaby, and at this point, I think he'd be my favorite candidate, it's a sign that, they think that they're actually making a genuine attempt to be at the cutting edge, to be ahead of the curve, which is very un-Jets-like, at least in recent years, because the Jets have always kind of been chasing trends. Jets have always been kind of like the latest adopters of any trend out there. So if they do that, I think it's a sign that, they're focused on actually being ahead of the curve. They're actually focused on, being an innovative team. I'd be really happy with that. Another candidate who intrigues me, Trey Brown. He works with the Cincinnati Bengals front office. This candidate really interests me for a couple of reasons. First of all, he actually left the NFL for a bit and worked in a couple minor leagues. And he kind of ran those front offices. He did not have the official title as general manager, but he built two successful teams in 2 smaller leagues. And you know what? You can make fun of it all you want, but those are professional football leagues. And there's something to be said for being the person who's in charge of supervising, the person who's in charge of hiring a scouting staff and supervising them, the guy who's in charge of making the final decisions on players. Those are things you can't simulate. And in some ways, that's more of an applicable job than a lot of scouting jobs are, where you're just like purely evaluating players. Another thing I like about him, he's come from Cincinnati. Cincinnati has one of the smallest scouting staffs in the league. I think they actually have the smallest scouting staff, which means there's probably more on his plate than your typical guy in his position. And the Bengals, like every team in the league has these bloated scouting staffs now. And look, I believe you got to invest in scouting. But the Bengals have punched above their weight class for quite a while as a front office. They've made great evaluations. And I think like maybe there's efficiencies that can be found. If the Jets are focused on a guy who's got experience, a guy who's focused on exploiting those efficiencies, well, maybe Trey Brown's the guy they should hire. Another candidate, a guy from the Vikings front office, Ryan Grigson. He is the former GM of the Colts. He's a guy the Jets were interested in. I got to say, of the candidates, the one that I have the most reservations about, because his time with Indianapolis was not good. He was pretty much gifted Andrew Luck. He stepped into a situation where he had the number one pick in the year Andrew Luck was drafted. Andrew Luck is the greatest quarterback prospect of the 21st century. And I don't think there's any other way to put it than this guy blew it. This guy created a terrible situation. He did not draft well. He did not make smart free agent signings, squandered so many resources. The Colts had good years because they had Andrew Luck, because Andrew Luck was that good. But Grigson built such a terrible offensive line that Luck got banged up. And I think that in some ways led to Luck's premature retirement. With Grigson, look, I'm not going to rule anybody out because people change, people learn over the course of their careers. But with Grigson, I feel like if you hire him, maybe it's a sign that you're looking for someone who's been on the job before and somebody who's shown that he can learn, because I think Grigson has a lot of questions he'd have to answer before I'd feel comfortable with him. But, some people are better the second time they do a job than they are the first time. So I don't know. Maybe he's that type of guy. Ray Farmer, senior personnel executive with the Rams. And, he's received a lot of credit for the Rams drafting. There's this perception the Rams don't care about picks because their general manager had a very famous statement about it where he used kind of an expletive about draft picks. The Rams trade a lot of first round picks for established players, but the Rams actually stockpile a lot of picks rounds 3 through 5. And part of the reason they've been able to remain successful, despite all the big name players who have departed in recent years, is they nail a lot of their picks. Now, Farmer was also the general manager of the Cleveland Browns during a very turbulent period, a very turbulent two-year stretch of their existence. And Brown was technically the GM who made some horrible picks, including Johnny Manziel. But I think that was the owner. I don't think Farmer really had anything to do with that. If you're hiring Farmer, I think it's a sign that you prioritize a guy who's worked in different organizations, one successful, one not so successful, a guy who maybe understands the difference between the two, and a guy who can help you avoid the pitfalls that you saw in Cleveland. And then you have Mike Greenberg, who's the assistant general manager of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. That's not the same name as the ESPN host who's a big Jets fan. Not the same guy. He's actually been an NFL executive for quite a while. He's got local ties to the team, like the ESPN version of Mike Greenberg. This Mike Greenberg actually grew up in the New York area also and is also a Jets fan. Tampa Bay has been one of the more interesting run teams in the league. I think a lot of people thought that team would have some lean years after Tom Brady retired. But even after the retirement of Brady, they've continued to be in the mix. They were a Final Eight team last year, and this year they won the NFC South. They're the 3 seed in the NFC. So I think that if you bring in a Greenberg, maybe it's a sign that your priority is finding a guy who understands how to navigate, how to thread the needle, how to navigate difficult times. So really a question of what the Jets prioritize. I think it's difficult to truly evaluate GM candidates because unless you're making the final decision, you don't really know who's responsible for what in each organization. Again, very tempting, especially with a guy from Kansas City, to just assume he'll come in and turn your organization into Kansas City. That's not always the case. I don't think you can have that mindset. I think it's more a question of which skill sets do these guys bring to the table. And that's something the Jets will decide in the days and weeks ahead. And here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll close out the show by talking about how the general manager and head coach hire need to work together, because I think there's a perception sometimes that you're hiring a GM, you're hiring a head coach, and you're kind of like playing fantasy football. You're just picking the best of both worlds. But in reality, how they work together is just as important as their quality. And we'll go into more detail on that as we continue here on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Game Time. I love going to live events, whether it's sports, music, theater, or comedy. One of my favorite memories of last year was going to a Jets game. I know it was a terrible Jets season, and the game was a loss. Jets lost to the Seahawks the Sunday after Thanksgiving, but I still had a lot of fun going out to MetLife Stadium. Well, Game Time has made it even easier to get tickets to your favorite events. with their new feature, Game Time Picks. This feature filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. I use Game Time myself. I've used it plenty of times through the years. I've used it to get good tickets on Broadway shows. I've used it to go to football games, even used it to go to U.S. Open tennis once. Super easy to use. You just pull out the app. And my favorite thing is that they have all-in pricing, so there's no hidden fees. You know exactly what you're paying for at the time you buy the tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL, one word with no space, for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Tuesday. We're talking about the Jets' search for a new general manager and a new head coach. And I think there's a temptation to view these searches as being on parallel tracks that don't really impact each other. But in reality, they make quite a bit of difference, because it's not just that you need to hire a good head coach and you need to hire a good general manager. This isn't like fantasy football. You need these guys to be able to work together. You need a head coach to communicate what he needs in players. You need a general manager who's able to find those guys. You need a trust between the two of them. You need a head coach who understands if a GM needs to cut a player for cap purposes, or if a GM maybe needs to make the team a little bit weaker now in order to improve it in the future. It's really important to have a good relationship between those two guys. And how these searches go, could depend on a couple of things. And I think the thing that has the biggest impact potentially is the New England coaching search. We talked about this a little bit yesterday. I have viewed through this whole process, which hasn't been that long, the Patriots situation as like the thing that could tip the scales as to whether or not the Jets could get Mike Vrabel. Because I think things were lining up in a way that the Jets were in strong position to land Vrabel. As the only team searching for a new general manager, Vrabel, a guy who's been pretty vocal that he wants at least some degree of say over what the front office is going to do. He wants to make sure there's alignment. The Jets were the team that could give it to him. And the Jets are in such a desperate spot after such a miserable 2024 that they probably would have given him what he wanted. And Vrabel had even said, Bill Belichick is famous for disliking the Jets, and Vrabel was a Belichick guy. So there was a lot of speculation. Would Vrabel be interested in the job? Vrabel said that, if the Jets give me what I want, I'd be interested. But the Patriots were there lurking. And the question was, would they fire Gerard Mayo? And they did. And once that happened, that created an obstacle for the New York Jets, because Vrabel played with the Patriots. He knows the owner, Robert Kraft, well. And the Patriots, frankly, have not been very well run the last couple of years. The Patriots have been a very poorly run franchise. That said, though, at the end of the day, I think almost anybody, especially a guy who played for New England in the dynasty years, is going to prefer Robert Kraft being their boss to Woody Johnson. And even if Vrabel doesn't specifically pick the GM, he's going to be comfortable with the organization. Now, I think if Vrabel was the guy, and look, maybe there's a chance he is. I mean, he hasn't officially been signed by New England at the recording point of this podcast. So look, it's not over till it's over. If the Jets got Vrabel, I think Vrabel would kind of like have a lot of sway over who the GM is. If the Jets don't get Vrabel, I think then it's going to depend on who the GM is, because I think then the Jets will probably go to a model where the GM is stronger than the head coach. At that point, I think you'll probably want the GM to be hired first. And the early buzz, at least, and this could change, of course, is that the Jets are really going to focus on these these GM interviews the next couple of days. And if you followed what happened last year, Rick Spielman, who's assisting Mike Tannenbaum with the 33rd team, Spielman was a consultant on the Washington Commanders search last year. They wrapped it up very quickly when they landed Adam Peters from San Francisco. So, there's no guarantee it's going to end in the next couple of days. It's very possible, though. And I think that's what you'd want, because in a situation where the Jets aren't going to get Vrabel, and look, again, it's still too early to say that definitively, but it certainly seems like it's leaning in that direction at least, then you're going to want, in order to get the philosophical alignment you need, in order to get the trust you need, you're really going to want the GM in place before you start interviewing, or before at least the head coaching interviews get to too deep a point. I mean, you can do preliminary interviews. You can rule guys out who just clearly are not equipped to handle the job. But once you get to those final round interviews, you want the GM in place, because you don't want another situation where you're just kind of pairing two guys and hoping they work well together. So we've been through that with the Jets before. We were with this in 2015. In 2015, the Jets were in a similar spot to where they are now, where they had fired John Idzik and Rex Ryan, and they were kind of running two parallel searches. And at the end of the day, they kind of matched up Mike McCagnon and Todd Bowles. And the biggest issue was that McCagnon just wasn't very good at his job. But the two of them never really had a relationship. I believe McCagnon was in on Bowles' very end interview when it was clear they were about to hire Bowles, but the things were already really far down the road at that point. They just kind of paired two guys. You want this GM to have a lot of say. In fact, you almost want the GM to make the choice. You want someone he's comfortable with. And, you can speculate, would the guy from Kansas City, the assistant GM from Kansas City, Mike Borgonzi, would he want Matt Nagy, who works in Kansas City? Matt Nagy was another Chiefs offensive coordinator, works under Andy Reid, works in Kansas City. Would Borgonzi be comfortable with him? I don't think that I'd necessarily conclude Borgonzi is going to pick Matt Nagy just because they work together. A history of working together in the past can be indicative of something, but it's not always. Sometimes other people in the league. Sometimes people in the league you want to work with who aren't with your team. So I think it's too early to speculate on any of those things. But again, I think you want alignment, because as much as you want a good GM and you want a good head coach, but it's just as important. Look, it's not, if you have a bad head coach and a bad GM who work together, it's not going to help your team. But if you have a good head coach and a good GM who don't work together, your team's not going anywhere. So it's not just about nailing these specific hires. It's not just about getting people in place. It's about getting the right people in place, the right mix, because you got to be able to have guys who communicate well. You've got to have guys who work together well. You got to have guys who trust each other and trust each other's intentions, because we've seen this in the past. And, I gave you one example. There are many examples in recent Jets history where the coach and the GM weren't on the same page, and it just derailed everything. And there were some situations where it was bad anyway, but it just took a bad situation and made it worse. So this is critical for the Jets. So I'm going to be very interested to watch the next couple of days to see how the Jets handle the GM search, whether they put that on the fast track ahead of the head coaching search, which would make sense, because the head coaching search, you also have to deal with all the regulations of the coaches in the playoffs. So that, that kind of slow walks the coaching process anyway. Definitely things worth examining as we move forward here with these Jets searches. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on the podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Tuesday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets. And please send in your mailbag questions, because we're going to do our weekly mailbag. Talk to you then.